We are pampered and kept shrouded away from death in the Western world. In Australia, our coffins are kept discreetly closed so that only the nurse's eyes, the doctor's eyes and the mortician's eyes see our corpses. Children who grow up in the suburbs and the city are often spared the sight of dead animals, unlike their country cousins. Yet is it right that this should be so? Is death not a natural part of life? Doesn't everybody die eventually? Doesn't everything have an end in this world? Would it not be wiser to face and accept the fact of death, rather than having death hidden from our eyes as if it was unnatural and macabre? In Mexico and in Asian and African cultures, the Day of the Dead is celebrated annually. Gatherings of families and friends pray for and remember families and friends who have died. The North American Indians have a similar day, as do many communities. Traditions connected with the holiday include building private altars honouring the dead, using sugar skulls, marigolds and the favourite foods and beverages of the deceased, and visiting graves with these as gifts. It is a time of celebration, when eating and parties are common. The term skeleton at the feast comes from the tradition of placing a skeleton at the table, as men and women eat, to remind the living to make the most of their lives, to eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we might die. When I was 22, my 19-year-old nephew died in a motorbike accident. I asked my sister, his mother, if I could view his body, and she refused, telling me that it was better to remember him as he was when alive. My 91-year-old mother died a couple of years ago. I hadn't seen her for a number of years, and I told this same sister that I would like to see Mum's dead body. She immediately grew angry, telling me to go and look at a piece of roadkill instead. She implied that there was something unnatural and morbid about my wish to see my mother's dead body. When I was able to get a word in, I explained to her that my desire to see my mother's body was because I had not seen her for many years, and I would like to see what life had done to her. It would have been my last view of her. Unfortunately, physical disability stopped me from following through on this. My ex-parents-in-law had immigrated from the Netherlands when their first 2 children were very young. At the time they had a son and a daughter. Their 2-year-old daughter died under anaesthetic during a minor operation, and my ex-parents-in-law were terribly grief-stricken. My ex-father-in-law carefully carved a headstone for his child's grave, but was told by the council that, although not large, it did not fit the exact size requirements for that particular cemetery. My ex-father-in-law took the intricately carved headstone back to his house and smashed it up with a sledgehammer. Some years later he had a nervous breakdown. My ex-father-in-law and ex-mother-in-law never got over this. I was very interested to see that my ex-mother-in-law had kept photographs of the corpse of her dead baby girl lying in her coffin. I found this a far more natural thing to do than the whole frightened and horrified attitude of my sister. After all, is it not the physical person who we miss? When somebody close to us dies, people often refer back to photographs of that person. Wouldn't it help us to have a photograph of the corpse of that person, thus providing some sort of closure? In Australia, we must either be buried in expensive, useless coffins or be cremated. I would like to be buried in the earth so that my corpse would give sustenance to the insects and the vegetation. I would especially like to be buried underneath a young tree, so that as my flesh decayed it would provide nutrients and nourishment for that tree. But no, not in Australia. The nearest that I can come to that is to be burned up and have my ashes scattered. As far as I know, it is not easily allowed by the government to have the simple wish fulfilled of your carcass being returned to the earth to rot gently into the ground. Isn't the Tibetan custom of cutting up dead bodies and leaving them out for the vultures to feed on more beneficial than our so-called civilised ways? Our ways involve people leaving their organs to science. This may mean helping other people by supplying them with a needed transplant, but it might also mean having our arms, our heads, or our other body parts being kept intact inside jars of fluid and exhibited on shelves in chiropractic and medical archival buildings for any visitors to stare at. It may mean 6 or 7 medical or chiropractic students cutting into our bodies, or even more, because multiple students often share the same body part from the same body. When my spirit leaves my body, I do not believe that I will either have much interest in it any more, or any use for it, but it's much nicer for me, still alive, to imagine it rotting away in the ground, or providing sustenance for our fellow creatures. If I could, I would have it thrown into a hole in the ground and the dirt cover it, but no, this is not allowed. Another nice idea that a friend told me about is the wish to have his body left near an ant-hill for the ants to feed on, but this also would not be allowed. I would like my family and friends to rejoice when I die, to be upset if they miss me, but if they like to sit around and play theirs and my favourite music, to have a drink and something to eat, to enjoy the fact that they knew me and cared for me and that I knew them and cared for them, to be together and to laugh and cry together, to celebrate the fact that I had finished my life's journey and moved on, and to be openly sad if they missed me, to grieve and celebrate together, like at an Irish wake. I'd like those who like to dance to get up and dance. The expression "to dance on your grave" springs to mind, but I'd be very happy if anybody danced on my grave. Why be shy about death? Why treat it as an ultra-sensitive and taboo subject? Once the spirit is free of the body, it is only those who miss the physical presence of that person who are sad. And I believe that becoming accustomed to the thought of death might ease your way in any possible afterlife. Who hasn't heard of earthbound ghosts who don't believe that they're dead? Who hasn't heard of those ghosts who were so sure of their religious beliefs when they were alive, that when dead they don't recognise the afterlife as being strictly in accordance with their previous life's belief structure, and so fail to move onwards for a very long time? I also don't want formaldehyde or embalming liquid being put in my veins, and I don't want to be falsely beautified with cosmetics. But do I have this choice? Why bother doing these things to dead meat? Why not grind us up for blood and bone and use us to fertilise a beautiful garden? Or to scatter this blood and bone in environmental projects? We could be replenishing and nourishing the earth, and instead we are laying our dead in expensive coffins that take decades or more to decay. At the very least we could be using biodegradable coffins, surely. And why do the dead so often become sanctified after death? If they weren't good enough to be complimented in life, why suddenly pretend that they were wonderful people when they're dead? This double standard is foolish, in my opinion. If I've been nasty to people, hurt their feelings, then let them say what they like about me. Just because I died doesn't make it necessary that they should speak well of me. The old saying goes, "Never speak ill of the dead," and I think that this saying is rooted in fear, the fear of a ghost overhearing you speak ill of it and returning to haunt you. In my opinion, I'll be too busy and happy in the afterlife to bother haunting anybody, but has anybody else noticed the fearful epitaphs on graves? "Rest in peace," or "Say a prayer for their soul." Words that sound frightened that the dead might return, rather than happily wishing them on their way. I've read many epitaphs and have been struck by the frightened words of the living. Cemeteries, for all their waste of ground, are a good piece of parkland, where wildlife can thrive, gardens can grow, and peace can be had. The epitaphs also provide interesting reading with their slices of history and nice carvings. I'd still prefer a tree, though, or even a shrub, to flourish on my remains. I suppose that it's a personal preference, but I do believe that we are too sheltered from death, and that our dead bodies could be put to better use. In a way, I suppose that I think that the earth, vegetation, and insects that we deprive by burying our discarded remnants in elaborate, ridiculously expensive and unbiodegradable caskets get a raw deal.